Thank you. I had done this presentation for the Forget Plymouth Rock course that David taught this summer. And the reason I got interested in this is I'm a native Mainer. I was actually born in Bangor, Maine, which is right near the Old Town Penobscot Indian reservation. And I also was born in Maine but raised in Natick, Massachusetts. So I had a lot of interest in this, having heard about John Eliot and the Indians. So I decided that I would look into more of the war in Maine, and so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So the war in Maine, for the most part, has been ignored by scholars. It really hasn't been addressed as much as the war here in southern New England. And it was really a conflict between the Wabanaki Indians and the English settlers in northern New England. So where we're talking about is this Maine Grant area up here, which is was handed back and forth a number of times between New York, Massachusetts, whatever. But originally it was settled by people from Plymouth. So what was Maine like prior to the war? This is the Wabanaki territories. It encompasses quite a large area. It's the space between what's now northern and central New Hampshire, Maine, southern Quebec, and it's between the English settlements here in New England and the French settlements here in New France. So it's quite a large area that it encompassed. And who are the Wabanaki, or the Abenaki? Depends on who you read, and it's an interchangeable name. It means Dawnlanders or Eastern Indians, which explains, if you know anything about Maine, that's the first place the sun comes up in the United States. So this area that's out here is where the first sunshine comes. So they were natives of the Dawnland. It was used collectively to describe all the Algonquin-speaking tribes in the region, which included Western Abenakis, Eastern Abenakis, the Passamaquoddies, I can't pronounce the first, and the Micmacs. The Eastern Abenakis inhabited areas of Maine, east of the White Mountains, and as well as parts of Canada, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia. And the traditional territories of the Western Abenaki consisted of most of Vermont, New Hampshire, and extended down into the northern part of Massachusetts, what's now Massachusetts. So these are the Eastern Abenaki tribes, and you'll hear about some of them when I talk about who was fighting. The Penobscots, the Kennebecks, the Aroostookooks is also the, there's another name for them, and we'll get to that, and the Pigwackets. So great names. And these were the Western Abenaki tribes. And the Penacooks we'll also talk briefly about. They're the southernmost that lived in this area, and then the others up in the north are really less involved in King Philip's War. Okay, so at the time of the 1660s, Plymouth Colony had people who went out and established trading posts in small areas, mostly in areas that are now York, which is now York, Maine, Falmouth, which is the present-day Portland, Maine. And when you look on the maps, I'm going to show you when it says Falmouth, that's really where Portland is, not the current Falmouth, Maine. And then a couple of smaller places like Pemaquid that's further up the coast. They really did not press inland at all. This was challenges because of the dense forest in that area. It wasn't as clear as this, it hadn't been burned out like the area down here in southern New England, and conflicts with the Native American tribes when they tried to push inland. And the French were there. And so different regions of Maine were contested by the French, particularly in the northern part of Maine. So the people from Plymouth really didn't go up into the northern parts of Maine. They stayed in the southern part. Yeah.
Was it also because, was it hard to land in Maine because of glacial moraine, or?
No, there are a lot of rivers, and what they did was actually set up their trading posts at the mouths of most of the major rivers in Maine, and we'll see that on the map in a minute. So this is the settlements that were in Maine in the 1670s. So this is before the war, The English settlers were living very peacefully with their Wabanaki neighbors. Mostly the settlers, the colonists, were engaged in fishing, harvesting timber, and trade with the natives, usually fur trade. And in 1657, English towns and trading posts stretched along the coast up to about the Kennebec River. Everything north of that pretty much was not area that they went into. That was where the French had more influence. And so this was really from here south, Kennebec River south, to the Portsmouth area in New Hampshire. And these communities were very scattered. They had no fortifications at all. And so the English settlements were very defenseless. And they really depended on the relationship between themselves and the Wabanakis remaining friendly and peaceful. So you can see these were the major towns: York, Wells. This is the old, as I said, this is now Portland. It was called Falmouth. And then there were these trading posts up here in a small town in Pemaquid. But not a lot. There were not a lot of people. Yeah.
I'm sorry for my ignorance, but where did these colonies come from?
Plymouth.
So they had spread out for
Yeah,
several generations.
many of them wanted to go and become traders. They came, so if you look at this Hammond's Trading Post or Clark and Lake Trading Post, these people were going here because they wanted to establish trading posts, much like Roger Williams did. He wanted to trade, so he established a trading post. Yeah.
Did they tend to bring whole families the way they did, more in southern New England, or were these trading posts which were composed mainly of men, like, say, is it Weymouth that started that
Yeah.
earlier?
Yeah, the ones that got in trouble. I think these up in here were more traders, and the area down in here were more, there was trading, but also there were people who were beginning to colonize the area. Yeah.
So these people were seeking economic opportunity, not religious freedom then?
No, they were going up there because they saw it as an opportunity.
And Ed Winslow went up there in 1623 to set up a trading post.
That failed.
Yeah, in order to make money to pay back the investors for the Mayflower.
Yeah, I didn't talk about that, but there was this failed Popham colony that he started, and the winter was so severe that all the colonists pretty much, it's like Jamestown, they vanished pretty much when he went back in the next year.
Question?
Yeah,
All right, so these trading posts are established pretty much on the rivers,
yeah,
near the mouths of the rivers.
yeah.
So does that mean the natives came down the river and did the trading at the post, and then other people came up the coast, or how did that work?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much the people who were at these trading posts, the Abenaki tribes were up in here, and they were bringing furs down to trade and get, guns and goods. So these trading posts were really, if you can see the map pretty well, they're all really at the mouths of rivers, because what they then did was take the furs and send them to England or wherever by boat. So they wanted to be able to be at a place where they could have good anchorage for a boat to come and take the goods away. So if you've been to Maine at all, it's little fjords, it's all these rivers that go up. So it's not surprising that there were all these trading posts, because there are all these little inlets that go into rivers. The major ones being the Kennebec, the Androscoggin, the Saco rivers. Those are the three main rivers.
Is that a trading post up at Machias, or is that just pointing out the end of the world at that time?
People did attempt to go up there, but it wasn't a very hospitable place. The weather wasn't
Still
so
isn't,
great.
right?
That's what I was gonna say, it's still not.
Right, the weather isn't so great, and the French were there as well, and so that, most of the time they didn't press up into that area. I didn't find out much more. I had the same question, what's going on in Machias, but I couldn't find anything anywhere to explain who was there and how long they were there, but I don't think they were very successful.
Were these
Beans
hardcore
and-
Puritans up there or what?
What?
Were
Oh,
these hardcore-
these were all people from Plymouth. These were all, but some of them were the more,
More
not
like
so.
Roger Williams or attitude or?
I think they were more the adventurers, the people who, perhaps, if you remember when the first people came to Plymouth. There were the saints and the strangers. There were people on that boat who were not religious separatists. So I think a lot of people who went up and did this sort of thing were people who were looking for economic opportunity. And I don't know what their religious persuasion was. It didn't really, in everything I've read, there wasn't much mentioned about, any kind of religious focus of this particular.
Yeah, they weren't up there to build meeting houses,
No. No, they were not building meeting
and
houses.
they weren't recruiting pastors.
No, they were going and fishing and harvesting timber mostly. Okay, so they were scattered among these settlements. They were strung out on the coast or the lower river basins. The Wabanaki north and east of the Kennebec River formed alliances with the French, which meant that it was inhospitable territory for the Plymouth people to go to. And by 1670, the indigenous communities, sounds familiar, became increasingly frustrated with the settlers, especially those in the southern portion of the state, who were bringing in cattle, etc., and trampling their cornfields. But the other thing, and the land encroachment, but the two major differences is there was a lot of rum trading going on and a lot of abuse of the Native Americans by giving them rum and then cheating them, especially with the things that they brought to sell. And obviously these trade disputes. And these were the issues that really led to the conflict in Maine. So the beginning of the war, the people in Maine, the colonists who lived in York, and York was one of the areas where there were a number of families and it was really more than just a simple trading post. They marched up the Kennebec River in June of 1675 and demanded that the Wabanakis turn over their guns and ammunition as a sign of goodwill. The Wabanakis hadn't done anything. They were doing it in response to what was going on, and the colonists were going on in the southern area. But in September 9th of 1675, the Wakely family was massacred at their farm, and this is all in very much southern Maine. And this attack was really the first full-scale violent attack that would eventually lead to the full-scale war between the white settlers in Maine and the Wabanakis. Okay, so when the war began, the English settlers and government officials viewed these Wabanakis as a monolithic group that had violated an agreement against violence. And the Wabanakis were not an organized group. There were a lot of individual groups. They were not a confederation. They didn't get together like Philip did would try to do with other tribes. They really pretty much went it on their own. And this disconnection between the Indian motives, most of them didn't want to have any problems. They were happy trading. They didn't want to, they didn't want to get involved. And the English interpretations of what they were up to really caused a lot of issues, as it did in the South as well. So the English then fanned the flames of war. They didn't help themselves. They refused to sell needed ammunition to the Indians for hunting, and the Indians needed that to hunt game and feed themselves. They issued general orders to kill Indians on sight, even though the Indians weren't doing anything at that point in time. They were overly generous in their bounty policy, so if you brought in an Indian captive, you got quite a bit in return. And they also issued these warrants kind of indiscriminately to capture Indians, regardless of what the Indians were up to. At that time, most of them were not up to anything other than trying to, eke out their subsistence living. So the timeline, so we're talking about autumn of 1675. The Wabanakis, as very small groups of them, got very tired of all of this going on, and they began attacking trading posts and settlers. So they attacked Portland, they attacked Saco, they attacked Scarborough, they attacked Biddeford, they attacked Scarborough again, they attacked York, they attacked South Berwick and Salmon Falls, and they killed and captured more than 150 English from the Kennebec to the Piscataqua rivers, and that's Piscataqua is the one that goes through Kittery in that area in Maine. So it's that area of the coast. And then they decided to go to their winter camps. They weren't going to pursue anything during the winter. So it was a pretty devastating fall for the settlers in that area because they were attacked over and over again.
What happened to the 150 capturees when they went to the winter camp?
I don't know what they did with them. I don't have any idea. I didn't read anything about that. They did kill quite a few people. I mean, they had no way to dispose of them like the settlers or the colonists did, where they sold them to slavery. So I don't know what they did with them. They may have.
They couldn't have fed them all winter.
No, I think
They
maybe
didn't have the
they
resources.
probably ransomed them or did other things, but I didn't read anything anywhere that said what they did with all these people. And believe me, I read everything I could get my hands on.
Did these trading posts each have their own militia, or
No,
was it?
no, they were very small groups of people. Some of them built actually garrison houses, but there were very few fortifications. There was very little in the way of military presence. These people had been living peacefully together, trading, harvesting timber, fishing, but they hadn't had squabbles with the Wabanakis much, except trading issues for the most part. So it wasn't, they hadn't felt the need to build garrisons. They were really a small group of people trading, or a small group of people who came to farm a small area at the mouth of a river. So in early January, the Wabanakis, who had not been doing too well in terms of food, professed sorrow for their hostilities and concluded a peace treaty with Major Waldron. Now, Major Waldron will appear over and over again, and he was not a trustworthy person at all for the Indians who tried to negotiate with him. So the peace lasted until about August. So from January to August, there was very little going on in Maine. It seemed like things had calmed down. And then on August 9th, there was an attack on the Brackett settlement on Casco Neck, leading the settlers to flee that area. And then August 12th is when King Philip is killed. So you see the war ends in southern New England, but this is just the beginning of what's going on in Maine. Two of those trading posts that I showed you that were in the northern part of the area were destroyed by the Wabanaki. And on September, there were attacks on Wells, on Cape Nettic, and then Waldron, who I said was a totally unreliable person as far as the Wabanaki were concerned, he tricked 200 of the pennant cooks in the southern area of Maine and New Hampshire to meeting, and they came believing they were going to establish a peace. They had no wish to fight. They were disarmed without any deaths on either side, and then he captured all of them and sold them into slavery, killing about 7 or 8 of them who were accused of killing Englishmen, and those people were hanged. So this is called Waldron's Ruse, and obviously if you were a Wabanaki and heard about this, you were going to be pretty angry and really feel like you had been done very poorly. So you'll hear about Mog Hagon and his compatriot, he's an Androscoggin, and the Penobscot Sagamore, who was Madoc Kawando. These two sachems began a concerted campaign against the colonists and settlers in the area. Mog captured the fort at Black Point in Scarborough, which was one of the few forts in the area. They attacked Wells but were repulsed, and in November, both of them signed a peace treaty with the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And again, the English did not do good things in terms of trying to settle the disputes. So the peace treaty he signed was filled with items that they would reject, or some provisions that were impossible to fulfill. So its major points: Makawando would go and convince all the Wabanakis to stop hostilities against the English, and he and his allies would declare war on their own people.
Wow.
If any of the Indians continued to be a problem. The Wabanakis would return all English captives. They captured ships, by the way, We'll talk about that in a bit. And goods and arms and artillery that they took from the English. So they were supposed to give everything back. The Indians would compensate the English for all the injuries, losses, damages to houses, cattle, estates, either immediately or yearly fees paid to the government of Massachusetts Bay. Okay. The English would begin to supply the Indians with powder, firearms, ammunition, other necessary supplies, but the Wabanakis could only trade for guns and ammunition with traders approved by the governor and the council. Okay. And as a gesture of goodwill, Mogg was to make himself a prisoner of the English until all these treaty stipulations had happened. Yeah, good treaty. I mean, would you sign this if you were a Wabanaki? I wouldn't. I mean, it didn't do much for them. Oops, sorry. Right, let me get back into slideshow here. David, any ideas? There's the
Yeah,
button.
you have to use the mouse.
Okay.
Just at the bottom there. Very bottom.
No.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, good.
Okay. So obviously, Mogg says to himself, if I refuse to sign this thing, I'm going to be dead. So he signs it. Then he's released to go contact numerous Indians on the coast to inform them of this treaty, and he flees. It doesn't take people in Boston very long to figure, these people are not going to live up to this treaty. And so on January 29th, 1677, the council orders Major Waldron, our favorite guy, to lead a contingent of 150 English militiamen and 50 native Indians to Maine and either destroy the Wabanakis or gain a lasting peace. Okay, so in February, Major Waldron betrays the Abenakis again. He offers a peace conference, which he disarms and seizes the native leaders. Obviously, the Wabanakis are not feeling that they're being heard at all, and they begin raids on York and on Wells. His Mogg Hagon and his forces again lay siege to the present-day Scarborough. Last 3 days, the Wabanaki killed 3 soldiers, captured a 4th, and on the 3rd day, Mogg was killed, and the Wabanaki militia ended the siege. They raid York and Wells again. On June 29th, the Wabanaki ambush a large force of colonial soldiers and their native allies near Scarborough, killing about 60 of that force. And they also steal about 20 fishing boats at that point. The colonists try these retaliatory raids on native villages, but they're very unsuccessful. They're no good at, bushwhacking their way through the Maine woods, and they really just are unable to retaliate at all. Unlike what was going on in southern New England earlier, where they actually were able to, the armies of the United Colonies were able to actually get and invade the homelands of the tribes. Here they weren't able to do that. Yeah.
Was the effort on the part of the Wabanaki to get the English to leave altogether?
Well, they didn't, in the beginning, they didn't want that. I mean, they were trading with them. It was a useful
Right.
symbiotic relationship, but yes, eventually, I think their goal was to get rid of these people that were treating them so badly.
Even though they knew that the effort to do that in the South had failed.
Yes. So the Wabanakis at that point sued for peace, and the fighting ends with this Treaty of Casco. There are no surviving copies of the treaty or its proceedings, so they use a summary that was made in 1784. The provincial governor of New York, which controlled Maine between 1677, so New York was now controlling Maine, not Massachusetts, signs the first Treaty of Casco with the Penobscot representatives, and they were the strongest. The Penobscots, they were the most northern tribe, and they had really fully wiped out the English colonists from their area. So under the terms of the treaty, the English settlers paid rent to the Penobscots and were given back their confiscated farmland. The English agreed to respect Penobscot land rights, The treaty sought to reestablish the friendly relationships that had occurred before the indigenous and settler communities that had characterized what had been going on in those areas before the outbreak of the war in 1675. So based on the terms of the accord, all captors were supposed to be surrendered without ransom, and the treaty also provided for closer government regulation of the fur trade to keep the Wabanaki from being cheated. You might guess how this came out.
Yeah.
The English settlers refused to abide by the terms of the treaty. The traders continued their old practices, including the sale of rum and getting the Native Americans drunk and then cheating them. Settlers placed fishing nets across the Saco River, preventing fish from migrating upstream to the Wabanaki villages, which was one of their big livelihoods. And the livestock continued to trample through the indigenous cornfields. There were negotiations and further treaty attempts, including a 1703 Treaty of Casco, but they were all ultimately unsuccessful, and confrontations on a small scale continued. And this is said to be the cause for the subsequent King William's War, and then there's a Queen Anne's War, and then there's another war. These are all the French and Indian wars that you may have read about in your history. So the outcome of the war was successful for the Wabanakis in some ways. They did get rid of all of these settlements. They were gone. So we really only had these left. So everything up here was destroyed thereafter. The fishing fleet, this was a big source of income, was fishing. And Maud had gone and repeatedly attacked towns such as Black Point, Wells, Damascus. He built a flotilla. He had about 40 sloops and a dozen 3-ton ships that he captured. And Maine's fishing industry was completely destroyed by the Wabanaki flotillas. So they lost, records from Salem record things like 20 catches stolen and destroyed by the Wabanaki. So this was a major source of income for people in that area, and especially the northern towns that were no longer there. One of the reasons they were no longer there was their livelihood. Fishing was destroyed. They really won pretty much an astounding victory, even though it turned out to be kind of bittersweet. They did push the English settlers and traders almost entirely out of the region, and they maintained a lot of power in eastern and northern Maine. There were about 260 English men, women, and children out of a population of about 3,500 who were killed. There's not an accurate account of the number of natives, obviously, because they didn't write anything down, but it's thought to be about 100 to 300. And 9 out of the 13 settlements were destroyed, completely gone, with only Kittery, York, and Wells, which are the southernmost remaining, and the fishing economy was devastated. So why was it different? Why was it different in Maine? In the South, the colonies marshaled their large population of materials for the war. In the North, they were underpopulated, they were poor, they had weak coastal towns that could not, even with the support of Massachusetts and New York, hope to defend themselves and subdue the Indians in Maine, much as the United Colonies had done, subduing the Poconokees and the Narragansetts and their allies. The English could not contend with a dispersed enemy that attacked in small parties at different times and places along the coast. Because the Wabanakis had no central army, they didn't make a central target. And so it made it very easy for them to raid and to vanish back into the woods. And there was really very little that the colonists or settlers could do to follow them or prosecute them in any way. The assumptions made by the English influenced the course of the war. They assumed that all the Wabanakis were armed for war. They minimized, as you saw, the overtures for peace. People would come in, and tribes would come in and say, we want to be peaceful. We don't want to have a war. We don't want to fight with you. But the English were susceptible to rumors, and they retaliated with violence against most of the Indians they encountered. So remember Waldron, more than once, twice, he really downplayed the overtures for peace that were made and actually caused those particular groups to be severely affected, being either slaughtered or sold into captivity. And so they gradually alienated so many of the different groups in Maine and New Hampshire by treating them all as hostile that they encouraged even the most pacific of the Wabanakis to join in trying to drive them out of the area. So they really didn't help themselves.
So the English never had any native allies?
No, not like Benjamin Church and his
Right.
Indian, no, the Wabanakis were not trustful, and for good reason. Every time they tried to make overtures, bad things happened to them. So the colonists did not vanquish the Indians on the battlefield. And this was the most humiliating treaty that any New England government had to sign with the Indians of the region. It's really... So it really wasn't the same war, even though some of the same people ended up fighting in it. It had its own causes, it had its own consequences, and it was really separate and distinct from the war in which Philip was the protagonist. The war in southern New England was much more devastating for native groups and than for the English colonists. The war in Maine continued until 1678, and the English settlements were nearly wiped out, and what was more important is colonial expansion was halted. People did not try and go up there. They did not try and push north. And so, that was being done in the Connecticut River Valley and everything else, but not in Maine. Those areas remained unsettled, mostly trading posts, mostly controlled by the French. Yeah.
Do we know if the Wabanakis were as devastated by disease?
Yes,
as
they
the
were.
Native people,
Yeah.
same mortality?
They had the same illnesses that ran through their area at about the same time it happened into the southern New England area. And so they were markedly decimated by, when settlers first began to come up there, their numbers were reduced.
And as far as you know, the Great Dying originated up there?
Yeah.
Came down the
Yeah,
coast?
came down the coast. Yeah.
You mentioned, I think a few weeks ago, that it wasn't necessarily smallpox, but other diseases that
The thought now, I'm an infectious disease
Right.
specialist. Some of the people who've really looked into it, it's very hard because there are not a lot of original sources that describe what people's illness was. The Native Americans don't describe it because they don't write, and so the best guess is that it was probably leptospirosis, which is a bacterial disease that's transmitted, can be transmitted by infected water. The animals can get it like dogs, and they can essentially contaminate pools or ponds, and people can get lepto from that. And it can be quite fatal. And the descriptions are that most people who have leptospirosis get jaundice, so they turn yellow. So some of the descriptions of people who had it were that they turned yellow.
Is that like animals coming off ships that would then
It was
interact?
it was probably brought to the New World by something coming off a boat. I don't think rats and mice are particularly involved, but dogs and cats can be.
Are they also big in Vermont, or were they big in Vermont at that time?
Well, there were tribes, yes, that went up the Connecticut River Valley in Vermont that were the Western Abenakis. They didn't have anything to do with any of this. They were pretty much,
Is this conflict in Maine known by any other names, since it's really not King Philip's War, is it?
No. That's why it's so hard to find out much about it. There's not a lot written about it. Jill Lepore's book has some stuff about the war in Maine. And I found things here and there, and I read some things that have been written in Maine Historical Society, articles from 1909 and places like that. It's hard to find. There are a bunch of tribes up there that have continued. They didn't get decimated in the same way that the tribes here did. They were not they were not sold wholesale into slavery or, driven off so they had to scatter to protect themselves. They remained viable tribes, viable, groups of people, even though there was a lot of conflict still going between the French and the English in that area.
Are they on reservations or just on their own property?
The Penobscots do have a reservation in Old Town, But so many of them don't live there. I don't think it's not like the western reservations where people are on the reservation or you're not part of the tribe. I think the Narragansetts are like that, aren't they?
Yeah.
You know, people, you know, they have a tribe, but there's no particular,
No, there's no reservation at all. They
Yeah.
have an area where they live, but
yeah.
it's different.
I think the town of Old Town is an Indian town, but I'm not sure exactly. I didn't really read a lot more about what is happening now in modern time, but definitely they still have a presence, much more so than any of the Native American tribes do here, or have over the years.
I
Yeah.
have a question about the fishing industry, which is a
Yeah.
little tangential, but maybe somebody knows about it. The fishing industry was huge up there.
Yeah.
What were they doing? Was this cod and salting and then sending it
Yeah.
down to the islands? Is that, and then who took the place of that? Because the slave trade only expanded. I wonder who took their place once that was shut down, because I don't think the natives were salting cod and sending it to the
No,
West
no, no,
Indies.
no, they were not. They were keeping it for themselves to eat.
Yeah,
Um,
but this is
No.
huge amounts that.
Well, I mean, you remember Cape Ann and that whole area of Massachusetts I think, became a more established area for fishing and,
Well, it's one thing for tribal fishing on the rivers
yeah,
that they had done, but they didn't have large ships that went off the coast.
well, they did after they captured all
After,
the,
right, yeah.
but I don't think they used them for fishing. I don't know what they did with them. I never
Yeah.
could find out, once they had all these ships, what they did with them.
But there wasn't the same industry of fishing
Right.
that the Europeans established.
No, there was definitely not the catching of fish with these nets and then salting and the whatever. The Wabanakis tended to have fish weirs up the river where they'd catch small amounts of fish for their subsistence, but they weren't catching fish and salting and drying them and sending them to Boston for.
It seems that Massachusetts politicians weren't really motivated to get involved in the main part of the war. Is that accurate?
They did with that treaty that obviously was so unfavorable to the Wabanakis. But I think after that, New York somehow, and I don't really understand how New York became the dominant force in Maine over Massachusetts, but I think it was some sort of a negotiated thing between Governor Andros and the Mass Bay Colony. So after that, Massachusetts wasn't responsible for Maine from 1677 on. It was considered a part of New York for a while.
I just find it interesting that the Wabanakis didn't suffer the same consequences that the southern New England Indians did.
Well, they had much more of an upper hand.
Right.
You know, the colonists were weak, they didn't have reinforcements, they didn't have a lot of supplies. The Wabanakis were smart in the way they attacked. They would attack in small groups and vanish back into the woods. The woods were much more dense in Maine. If you've ever gone hiking in Maine, it's, you know, it's bushwhacking. It's not an open place as it was in, you know, other than the swamps here in southern New England. You could get around pretty easily. In Maine, once you get off the river, you're in the woods.
They also didn't lose.
Yeah,
I mean, that's,
they did.
yeah, I mean, you could wholesale sell everybody in southern New England, but you couldn't do that because they didn't lose.
Mhm.
I mean, yes, the settlers didn't honor the treaty, but on the other hand, the Wabanakis made out pretty well. They didn't get any bad consequences, really. They were allowed to go back to, the only places they really suffered were in southern Maine, where people were, you know, putting nets over their rivers, despite the fact that they weren't supposed to. The colonists were still doing that. But as far as northern, you know, Saco River north, the Wabanakis were really in control.
What kind of housing did the Wabanakis have? I'm thinking of the brutal Maine winters.
I've seen, I didn't put up here, but there are some pictures of they're bark covered, they're not the Weetus, the round ones, they tend to be more teepee shaped. I think probably so the snow slides off of them, but they're made of bark. But people have, you know, had lived there for thousands of years and adapted ways to survive the Maine winter. I agree, I've been up there in the winter, I've lived there in the winter, it's pretty cold.
Did they migrate to the coast at certain
Yeah,
times of the year?
they did, they had, remember I said it, that at the end of 1676, they went off to their winter camps. They stopped attacking and just went off to their winter camps, which tended to be more inland and not on the coast.
Yeah, both in the north and the south, the war kind of slowed down during the winter.
Yeah.
There wasn't as much activity. And
Yeah, in Maine, it would be hard because of the deep snow.
Okay, I've got a question just about historical sources.
Yeah,
When we, or earlier, Joe Lepore and all of those, there has been, there is some written documentation, from Plymouth and the area,
Yeah.
where it was. How much is there for the area you're talking? Did those guys write anything?
well, the Native Americans didn't.
No, but I'm talking about the
Yeah.
others.
There's relatively little written. That's why it's so hard to kind of piece it together.
Yeah, that's why I'm asking the question.
Well, there were only 3,500 people living there, so, it wasn't like there were a lot of people who were keeping records of things. They tended to be the kind of people who went and founded a trading post. They're not, writing about their experiences. And when you think about it, who wrote?
The
Most of it
winners.
was the
winners.
winners, and also
The clergy.
the clergy,
Right.
and there were not particularly this clergy in this area. It was mostly people who were adventurers and or settlers who were looking to find a place to start a farm. But
So
they were-
there was no, I know in the South, there were clergymen going out to convert the Indians.
No.
So there was
Nothing
nothing
that I
like
could
that up
find
there.
on conversion of the Indians or the Indians being co-opted into, serving on the military side for the English colonists. No. The Wabanakis were here, the colonists were over here.
Right.
They really didn't, good.
good. Well, thank you very much.